The fear of death follows from the fear of life. A man who lives fully is prepared to die at any time. These words belong to Mark Twain, the great American satirist who understood that death is not life's opposite, but its shadow companion, walking beside us through every moment of our existence. We spend our entire lives running from death, yet it is the one certainty we all share. We build monuments to immortality, craft legacies of remembrance, and accumulate possessions as if they might shield us from the inevitable. We speak of death in hushed tones, as if naming it might summon its presence. Yet death has been with us all along, patient and persistent, waiting at the end of every breath we take. What if everything we have been taught about death is backwards? What if our relationship with death is not something to be feared and avoided, but rather the master key to unlocking the fullness of life itself? What if, in turning away from death, we have simultaneously turned away from the deepest truths of existence? The ancients understood something we have forgotten. In the temples of ancient Egypt, initiates would lie in sarcophagi for days, experiencing a symbolic death before emerging reborn into a higher consciousness. The mystery schools of Greece taught that philosophy itself was a preparation for death, a practice of dying while still alive. The medieval monks kept skulls on their desks, not from morbid fascination, but as memento mori, reminders that death gives weight and meaning to every moment. In our modern world, we have sanitized death, hidden it away in hospitals and funeral homes, and created entire industries devoted to making death invisible. We speak of people passing away or moving on, as if death were merely a change of address rather than the fundamental transformation it is. We have lost the wisdom that our ancestors possessed, the understanding that death is not the enemy of life, but its necessary counterpart, the darkness that gives light its meaning. Consider for a moment the paradox at the heart of human existence. We are the only creatures who know we will die, yet we are also the only creatures who can forget this knowledge, who can live as if we have infinite time. This forgetting is perhaps our greatest psychological defense mechanism, but it is also our greatest tragedy, for in forgetting death, we forget life itself. The Mexican tradition of Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, reveals a profound truth that modern Western culture has largely abandoned. In this celebration, death is not hidden or feared, but embraced as part of the eternal dance of existence. Families build elaborate altars for their departed loved ones, offering food, flowers, and memories. They laugh and dance in cemeteries, not from disrespect, but from a deep understanding that death and life are not separate realms, but interwoven threads in the same tapestry. The ancient Egyptians believed that to speak the name of the dead was to make them live again. Their entire civilization was organized around death, not from morbidity, but from a recognition that how we face death determines how we live. The pyramids were not tombs of fear, but monuments to eternal transformation. The Book of the Dead was not a grimoire of darkness, but a guidebook for navigating the transition from one state of being to another. In the Egyptian conception, death was not an ending, but a journey. The soul would traverse dangerous passages, face judgment in the weighing of the heart, and if found worthy, enter the field of reeds, a paradise where one could live eternally in peace. But the journey required preparation. One's entire life was a rehearsal for this final voyage, and those who lived with awareness of death were those who lived most fully. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Bardo Thodol, serves a similar function. It describes the intermediate state between death and rebirth, a liminal space where consciousness encounters visions both terrifying and sublime. But here is the secret. These visions are not external realities, but projections of one's own mind. The peaceful and wrathful deities that appear are aspects of one's own consciousness, and recognizing this brings liberation. Death becomes not an external enemy, but an internal teacher. Buddhism teaches that all life is suffering, and that this suffering arises from attachment and the illusion of permanence. We cling to things, to people, and to our own sense of self, desperately trying to make permanent what is inherently temporary. Death is the ultimate teacher of impermanence, the final lesson that nothing can be grasped and held forever. Yet in accepting this truth, rather than fighting against it, we discover a strange freedom. The Buddhist monks who meditate on corpses in charnel grounds are not being macabre. They are cultivating what is called maranasati, mindfulness of death. By confronting the physical reality of decay, they are stripping away the illusions that keep us trapped in cycles of craving and aversion. They are learning to see through the veil of appearances to the underlying emptiness that is also fullness, the void that is also plenum. In Japanese culture, the concept of mono no aware captures the bittersweet beauty of impermanence. It is the poignant awareness that all things must pass, that cherry blossoms fall, that youth fades, and that every moment is unrepeatable. Far from being a source of despair, this awareness intensifies the beauty of each fleeting instant. The cherry blossom is beautiful precisely because it will fall. Life is precious precisely because it will end. The samurai lived by the code of Bushido, which included a practice called hagakure, hidden by the leaves. Its central teaching was to meditate daily on death, to imagine oneself already dead, so that one could live without fear or hesitation. When you have already died in your mind, what is there left to fear? When you have released your grip on life, you can finally, truly live. Western philosophy has not been entirely blind to these truths. The Stoics of ancient Rome practiced premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils, which included regular contemplation of one's own death. Marcus Aurelius, emperor and philosopher, wrote in his Meditations that we should live each day as if it were our last, not from recklessness, but from the recognition that it might actually be. The Stoics understood that death anxiety was at the root of most human suffering, and that by befriending death, we could free ourselves from needless fear. Socrates, facing his own execution, told his students that philosophy was nothing more than a preparation for death. The entire philosophical life was a practice of separating the soul from the body, of learning to identify with consciousness rather than flesh. When the hemlock came, Socrates drank it calmly, even cheerfully, proving through his death the truth of what he had taught in life. Martin Heidegger, the German existentialist philosopher, placed death at the center of his analysis of human existence. He distinguished between merely existing, which he called they-self, where we lose ourselves in the anonymous crowd and live according to others' expectations, and authentic existence, which requires confronting what he called being toward death. Only by recognizing our own mortality, only by facing the absolute limit of our existence, can we grasp the urgency and responsibility of our freedom. For Heidegger, death is not just something that happens at the end of life. It is a constant possibility that shadows our every moment. We are always dying from the moment of birth. This is not morbid pessimism, but liberating realism. When we truly understand that our time is finite, that every choice forecloses other possibilities, we can no longer hide in comfortable numbness. We must take ownership of our existence. The existentialists following Heidegger took this further. Jean-Paul Sartre argued that we are condemned to be free, thrust into existence without having chosen it, and forced to make meaning in an absurd universe. Death is the ultimate absurdity, the final negation of all our projects and purposes. Yet it is precisely because of death that our choices matter. In a universe of infinite time, nothing would be urgent, and nothing would be meaningful. Death gives life its edge, its intensity, its undeniable reality. Camus, in his essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, confronted what he called the fundamental question of philosophy, whether life is worth living. He used the image of Sisyphus, condemned by the gods, to push a boulder up a mountain only to have it roll back down, repeating this futile task for eternity. This is the human condition. We struggle, we build, we create, and death erases it all. The universe is indifferent to our suffering, our joy, and our very existence. Yet Camus concludes that we must imagine Sisyphus happy, not because his task has meaning imposed from above, but because he chooses to give it meaning. In the face of death and absurdity, we rebel through the act of living fully. This brings us to a crucial distinction. There is the fear of death, which paralyzes and diminishes us, and there is the awareness of death, which liberates and enlivens us. The fear of death makes us cling desperately to security, to comfort, to the familiar. It makes us postpone life, thinking we have infinite time. It makes us petty, anxious, and small. The awareness of death, by contrast, makes us bold, present, and alive. Ernest Becker, in his masterwork The Denial of Death, argued that the fear of death is the primary motivating force of human behavior. We construct elaborate psychological defenses against death anxiety. We build civilizations, create art, and pursue fame and fortune, all in a desperate attempt to achieve symbolic immortality. We want to live on in memory, in works, and in children. We want to matter, to have significance that transcends our biological extinction. Becker drew on the work of Otto Rank, who distinguished between the life fear and the death fear. The life fear is the anxiety of separation, of standing out from the herd, of being an individual. The death fear is the anxiety of dissolution, of losing oneself completely. We are caught between these two terrors, wanting to be unique individuals but also wanting to merge into something larger than ourselves. Much of human psychology is an attempt to navigate between these opposing fears. But what if there is another way? What if the problem is not death itself, but our relationship to it? What if we have been asking the wrong question? We ask, how can I avoid death? Or how can I make peace with death, when we should be asking, how can I use death as a teacher? The medieval practice of ars moriendi, the art of dying, was a spiritual discipline that recognized death as something requiring skill and preparation. Manuals were written to guide the dying through the final passage, helping them face the temptations and fears that arise in the last moments. But the art of dying was also understood as the art of living. One learned to die well by living well, and one learned to live well by keeping death in view. The Christian contemplatives spoke of dying to self, of ego death as the necessary precondition for spiritual rebirth. St. Paul wrote, "I die daily," meaning that the spiritual path requires a constant letting go of the false self, the ego, with its endless demands and fears. The death of the ego is not the end of consciousness, but its expansion into something vaster. The mystics of all traditions have reported similar experiences. In deep meditation or prayer, in moments of profound spiritual opening, the sense of separate self dissolves. There is a kind of death, a terrifying loss of boundaries, and then a rebirth into a larger identity. One discovers that what seemed like annihilation was actually liberation, that the death of the small self reveals the deathless nature of awareness itself. Carl Jung wrote extensively about death and transformation. He saw the second half of life as a time when the question of death becomes unavoidable, when we can no longer live on the momentum of youth and biological vitality. This is when the real inner work begins. We must turn inward, confront our shadow, integrate our unlived life, and prepare for the final transformation. Jung believed that the unconscious was preparing us for death throughout our lives, sending dreams and visions that hint at the continuation of consciousness beyond bodily death. In Alchemy, which Jung studied deeply, death and rebirth are central themes. The alchemical work of turning base metal into gold is really a metaphor for psychological and spiritual transformation. The process begins with the nigredo, the blackening, a phase of death and putrefaction. Everything must be broken down, dissolved, and destroyed. Only then can the albedo, the whitening, occur, followed by the rubedo, the reddening, which is the final achievement of the philosopher's stone, the treasure hard to attain, the self realized in its fullness. The alchemists knew something we have forgotten. Death is not merely physical. We die and are reborn many times in a single lifetime. Every major life transition is a kind of death. Leaving childhood for adolescence, adolescence for adulthood, the end of a relationship, the loss of a job, the shattering of cherished beliefs. Each of these is a small death, and each offers the possibility of rebirth into something new. But we resist these deaths. We cling to who we were, to relationships that no longer serve us, to beliefs we have outgrown, to identities that have become prisons. We refuse to let go, and so we remain stuck, half alive, neither dead nor truly living. The fear of death manifests as the fear of change, the fear of letting go, and the fear of transformation. Indigenous cultures around the world have initiation rituals that involve symbolic death. The young person is taken from the familiar, undergoes ordeals and trials, experiences ego death, and is reborn with a new name, a new identity, and a new relationship to the community and the sacred. These rituals recognize that psychological maturation requires death and rebirth, that we cannot become who we are meant to be while clinging to who we were. Modern Western culture has largely abandoned these initiatory practices, and we suffer for it. We have adolescents who cannot become adults, adults who cannot embrace the responsibilities of maturity, and elders who cannot accept the wisdom of age. We are a culture of people trapped in extended adolescence, refusing the necessary deaths that would allow us to grow. Consider how we relate to aging. We spend billions on anti-aging products, cosmetic surgery, and anything to stave off the visible signs of time's passage. We worship youth and vitality, treating old age as a disease rather than a natural stage of life. Yet the elders of traditional societies were honored precisely because they stood closer to death, because they had accumulated the wisdom that comes from repeatedly letting go, from surviving many deaths. The Lakota warrior's prayer says, "Today is a good day to die." This is not suicidal ideation, but radical presence. When you have made peace with death, when you have prepared yourself spiritually and psychologically, then you can face each day without fear. You are free to be courageous, to speak truth, and to love fully, because you have nothing to lose. You have already surrendered the one thing we all must eventually surrender. Near-death experiences have been reported throughout history and across all cultures. People who have come close to dying and then returned often report similar phenomena. The sense of leaving the body, moving through a tunnel toward light, encountering deceased loved ones or spiritual beings. Experiencing a life review where every action and its consequences are seen with absolute clarity, feeling overwhelming peace and love, and sometimes receiving knowledge about the nature of reality. What is striking about these reports is not just their consistency, but also their effect on those who experience them. People who have near-death experiences typically lose their fear of death. They return with a renewed sense of purpose, a deep appreciation for life, and often a reorientation of values. Things that seemed important before, like the accumulation of wealth or status, pale in comparison to love, connection, and service. It is as if touching death awakens them to what truly matters in life. But we do not need to literally die and return to learn these lessons. We can practice what some call near-death awareness while fully alive. We can cultivate what the poet Mary Oliver called the soft animal of your body loving what it loves, combined with the awareness that this body, these loves, and this moment will not last forever. There is a Zen story about a man being chased by a tiger. He runs to the edge of a cliff and begins to climb down a vine. Looking up, he sees the tiger above. Looking down, he sees another tiger waiting below. Then he notices two mice, one white and one black, gnawing at the vine. At that moment, he sees a wild strawberry growing from the cliff face. He plucks it and eats it. How sweet it tastes. The tigers are birth and death. The mice are day and night, gradually consuming our time. The strawberry is this present moment. When we fully recognize our predicament, when we stop denying death, we can finally taste the sweetness of life. This is the great paradox. The more we accept death, the more fully we live. The more we try to deny death, the more we are haunted by it, the more life becomes a desperate, anxious clinging. Death anxiety manifests in 1,000 subtle ways. The inability to commit, the constant need for distraction, the addiction to novelty, the fear of intimacy that might bring loss, the accumulation of possessions as if they could shield us from impermanence. Psychologists who work with the dying report that people's greatest regrets are not about things they did, but things they didn't do. They regret not expressing love, not taking risks, not being true to themselves, and not pursuing their dreams. They regret living according to others' expectations rather than their own deepest values. They regret, in short, not having truly lived because they were too busy protecting themselves from death. Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, who pioneered the study of death and dying, identified 5 stages that many dying people go through: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. But she later realized that these stages are not just about physical death. We go through similar stages with any significant loss or change. And we can get stuck in the earlier stages, refusing to reach acceptance, spending our entire lives in denial and anger about the fundamental conditions of existence. Acceptance does not mean resignation or passive surrender. It means facing reality as it is, rather than as we wish it to be. It means recognizing that death is not optional, not negotiable, and not something that happens only to other people. And paradoxically, this acceptance is liberating. When we stop fighting the inevitable, we free up enormous energy for living. The hospice movement has rediscovered something ancient wisdom traditions always knew: that dying can be a conscious, even sacred process. When death is accepted rather than fought against, when pain is managed compassionately, and when family and friends are present, dying can become a profound experience of letting go, of completion, and of transition. Many hospice workers report witnessing deaths of great beauty and peace. But to die well, we must live well, and to live well, we must live with awareness of death. This is not morbid preoccupation, but clear-eyed realism. Death is the context that gives life meaning. A story without an ending is not a story. A game where you cannot lose has no stakes. A life without death would not be precious. Imagine if you truly knew, with absolute certainty, that you had only 1 year to live. How would you spend it? What would suddenly become unimportant? What grudges would you release? What would you finally say to the people you love? What would you stop postponing? Now imagine that you have only 1 month, 1 week, or 1 day. The urgency increases. The unnecessary falls away. What remains is essence, what truly matters. This is the gift death offers, if we have the courage to accept it. Not someday, not eventually, but now, with every breath, death is teaching us what matters. The spiritual teacher Ram Dass spoke of the practice of dying consciously, which means paying attention to all the little deaths that happen in each day, the ending of each breath, the end of each thought, the end of each experience. Nothing lasts. Everything is constantly dying and being born. To live consciously is to remain aware of this eternal flux, to ride the wave of impermanence rather than resisting it. In meditation, we practice letting go. Thoughts arise and pass away. Sensations arise and pass away. Emotions arise and pass away. We learn not to grasp at pleasant experiences or push away unpleasant ones. We learn to rest in awareness itself, which is not born and does not die, even as all contents of consciousness are constantly changing. This is training for death, but it is also training for life. The Greek philosopher Epicurus taught that death is nothing to us. When we exist, death is not present. When death is present, we do not exist. Therefore, death is not an experience we will ever have. Why fear something that, by definition, cannot touch us? This is clever reasoning, but it may miss something important. We do not fear death as an experience, but as a loss, the end of all experience. Yet what are we losing? If consciousness is merely an epiphenomenon of the brain, then at death, consciousness simply ceases, like a candle flame going out. There is no one left to experience the loss. But if consciousness is something more fundamental, if awareness is the ground of being, rather than an emergent property of matter, then death is not an ending, but a transformation. Many mystics and philosophers have argued for this latter view. Plato believed the soul was immortal, that it existed before birth and continues after death, and that the body was merely a temporary vehicle. The Vedic philosophers of ancient India taught that Atman, the true self, is identical with Brahman, the ultimate reality, and is therefore eternal and unchanging. The death of the body is merely like taking off an old garment. Whether or not these metaphysical speculations are true, they point to something psychologically important. When we identify with something larger than the ego, when we recognize ourselves as part of a vast interconnected whole, death loses some of its sting. We may die as individuals, but we continue in the lives we have touched, in the effects of our actions, in the eternal dance of matter and energy. The physicist Erwin Schrödinger, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, wrote a remarkable essay called What is Life?, in which he argued that consciousness is not produced by the brain, but is rather fundamental to the universe. Death, in this view, is not the end of consciousness, but the end of a particular form through which consciousness manifests. The wave returns to the ocean, but the ocean remains. These are not just abstract philosophical questions. How we understand death fundamentally shapes how we live. If we believe death is absolute annihilation, we may feel a kind of cosmic meaninglessness, a sense that nothing ultimately matters, or we may feel a fierce urgency to make the most of this one brief life. If we believe consciousness continues in some form, we may feel less anxiety about death, but also less urgency about life, a dangerous complacency. The healthiest relationship with death is probably somewhere in between. We acknowledge uncertainty, and we admit we do not know with certainty what happens after death, but we live as if our choices matter, as if love is real, and as if meaning can be created even in the face of an inevitable ending. This is the existential courage that the philosophers spoke of, the ability to create meaning in an absurd universe, to affirm life even while facing death. There is a Sufi teaching that says, "Die before you die." This is the teaching of ego death, of surrender, of letting go of the false self so that the true self can emerge. Every spiritual tradition has some version of this teaching. You must lose your life to find it. The seed must die to become the tree. The caterpillar must dissolve completely in the chrysalis before the butterfly can emerge. We experience this in moments of profound transformation. The death of an old identity, painful as it is, opens space for something new to be born. The end of a relationship, devastating though it feels, creates possibility for new connection. The loss of a job or a dream forces us to discover resources we didn't know we had. Death, on every level, is also always birth. This is why grief is so important and why our culture's discomfort with grief is so destructive. Grief is the price we pay for love, the necessary consequence of attachment. To love anything deeply is to accept that we will lose it, and to lose it is to grieve. But grief, fully felt and honored, transforms us. It breaks open the heart. It deepens our capacity for compassion. It connects us to the universal human experience of loss. When we avoid grief, when we distract ourselves or numb ourselves or pretend everything is fine, we miss the opportunity for transformation that loss offers. We remain defended, armored against life. But when we allow ourselves to fully grieve, to descend into the darkness, and to feel the full weight of loss, something miraculous can happen. We discover that we can survive it. We discover resources of strength we didn't know we possessed. We emerge changed, scarred perhaps, but also more real, more alive. The same is true of other forms of psychological death, the shattering of illusions, the collapse of defenses, and the dark night of the soul, when everything we believed is called into question. These experiences are terrifying, but they are also necessary. We must be broken open before we can be made whole. The false self must die, so the true self can be born. Jung called this process individuation, the becoming of who we truly are. It requires confronting the shadow, integrating the repressed parts of ourselves, and making conscious what was unconscious. It requires many deaths: the death of the persona we show the world, the death of the ego's grandiose fantasies, the death of our parents' expectations, and the death of cultural conditioning. Each death is painful, but each death is also liberating. The goal is not to eliminate the ego, but to relativize it, to see it as one part of the psyche rather than the whole. When we identify exclusively with the ego, death is terrifying because it means total annihilation. But when we recognize the self, the totality of the psyche, which includes but transcends the ego, death becomes a transformation rather than an ending. This is represented symbolically in many traditions. The phoenix that dies in flames and is reborn from ashes, the death and resurrection of Christ. The descent of Inanna to the underworld, where she is stripped of everything before being restored. the journey of the hero who must die symbolically before returning transformed. These myths are not about literal death, but about the psychological deaths we must undergo to fully mature. Consider Jesus in Gethsemane, praying, "Let this cup pass from me, yet not my will but yours be done." This is the moment of surrender, the acceptance of death, the letting go of ego's will in favor of something larger. It is the most human moment in the gospel story, the moment when fear and acceptance meet. And it is this surrender that makes possible the resurrection, the transformation of death into new life. We all face our own Gethsemane moments, times when we must choose between clinging to what is dying and surrendering to what is being born. It is never easy. The ego fights for its life, as it must. But if we can find the courage to let go, to trust the process, to accept the necessary death, we discover that resurrection is real, not as supernatural magic, but as psychological truth. This brings us back to where we began. Your relationship with death is more important than your relationship with life, because death is the teacher that reveals what life is truly about. Death strips away pretense, removes the superfluous, and exposes the essential. In the face of death, we cannot hide from ourselves. We must confront the question, have I lived? Have I loved? Have I been true to myself? These are not comfortable questions, which is why we avoid them. It is easier to stay distracted, to stay busy, and to postpone the encounter with our own mortality. But the cost of this avoidance is high. We sleepwalk through life, going through the motions, never fully present, never fully alive. We exist, but we do not truly live. To develop a mature relationship with death requires practice. It requires bringing death into consciousness regularly, not obsessively, but mindfully. The daily meditation on impermanence. The periodic contemplation of one's own death. The practice of treating each day as if it might be the last, not with frantic urgency, but with deep appreciation. It requires grieving consciously, feeling loss fully rather than rushing past it. It requires allowing things to end, relationships to complete, and chapters to close. It requires saying goodbye, again and again, to who we were, so we can become who we are meant to be. It requires cultivating what the Buddhists call non-attachment, which is not detachment or indifference, but the ability to love fully while recognizing impermanence. We can cherish deeply while knowing nothing lasts. We can commit completely while accepting that all things change. This is the wisdom of the open hand rather than the clenched fist. Most importantly, developing a relationship with death requires confronting our deepest fears. What is it we are really afraid of? The pain of dying? The loss of consciousness? Leaving loved ones behind? Not having accomplished what we hoped? Being forgotten? These fears are real and deserve to be acknowledged, not dismissed. But often, beneath all these specific fears is a more fundamental anxiety. The fear that our life has been meaningless, that we have not mattered, that we have wasted the precious gift of existence. This is the existential dread that haunts modern consciousness. In a secular age, without the consolations of religion, we must create our own meaning, and we fear we have failed to do so. The answer to this fear is not to seek immortality, literal or symbolic, but to recognize that meaning is found in the quality of presence we bring to each moment, not in some grand achievement or lasting legacy. A life well lived is not necessarily a life of great accomplishments, but a life of great awareness, great love, and great presence. When we live with awareness of death, each moment becomes precious. The ordinary becomes extraordinary. A meal shared with loved ones, a walk in nature, a moment of creative absorption, the touch of a hand, these simple things reveal themselves as the miracles they are. We were always surrounded by wonder, but we were too distracted to notice. Death teaches us to pay attention. Death teaches us to say what needs to be said, to heal what can be healed, and to forgive and ask forgiveness. Death teaches us that we are not guaranteed tomorrow, that now is all we truly have. Death teaches us that love is the only thing that matters, the only thing that transcends our mortality. In the end, perhaps the deepest truth is this: we are all dying, we are all mortal, and we are all temporary manifestations of something eternal. The wave rises from the ocean and returns to the ocean. The form changes, but the essence remains. And in the brief time we have as individual waves, we have the opportunity to dance, to crash upon the shore with great beauty, to reflect the light, and to know ourselves as both wave and ocean. Your relationship with death is more important than your relationship with life, because death is the mirror in which life reveals its true face. Look into that mirror. Do not turn away. What you will see there is not an enemy, but a teacher, not an ending, but a doorway, not annihilation, but transformation. And in learning to face death with open eyes and an open heart, you will finally learn to live.